Well, thanks for coming. I don't know how many of you know anything about it, which may or may not be insights. We'll find out. So what we're going to do tonight is you have a copy of the schedule. There was one little podium out there, a little lecture. If you didn't get it, it was the back of down completely. Or welcome to hand them out. We're going to be talking about tonight a couple of things that will simultaneously be a little bit familiar, but also a little bit strange when it comes to this thing I have here displayed, the supernatural world with the Bible. Now, for those of you who are, broadly maybe in the religion department, your academics, what I want to get at tonight is pretty specific. How would an ancient person process what they've reading the Bible? What was originally written for them? And that's another way of saying when the biblical books were written. I'm not concerned about the process. I'm not concerned about source criticism or anything like that. We're not going to do any of that tonight. We're going to be operating from and to sort of drift into academic speak a little bit. You received text, the canonical text, the text that you can, as Jewish community, consider sacred, as the term canonical, and then also the early church who received the Jewish Bible as it was existing at the time, and also their own books of the New Testament as it was written, talking. But all those things we're including passages, both of those tonight, of course tomorrow as well. But again, we're going with the text as we have it. How would an ancient person process that? What would certain things mean to them? And I like to illustrate it this way. For those of you who are raised in a church or go to a church now, my illustration would be something along the lines of, you're in a small group Bible study, maybe in a classroom, and you're going around the room and you're looking at a particular passage and discussing a certain topic, and everyone sort of is expected to have their input. Hey, well, what do you think this verse means? What in the world is the writer talking about here? If you had someone from the second millennium BC sitting in the room, someone from the first century, maybe CE, sitting in the room, when you got to that person, that guy or that girl, their answer to what does this passage say, what do you think it means, is going to be a lot different than we would hear today at church or the Bible class or something like that. And the reason is very simple, because they come from another time and place. So what I want to challenge you with is, I'd like, if I want a conversation tonight, it's that you go away with a little bit more of the ancient writer in your head. Because we have been trained, because we're modern. We can't help it, we're modern. It's the 21st century. We think differently because of all sorts of reasons, historical forces, technology, science, whatever. We think quite differently than an ancient person would. But yet we've sort of been anesthetized to the fact that when an ancient writer was writing and how it was received by their original audience is actually quite different than the way it's now. And the only way you can really process a number of things in the Bible is to have the ancient person in your head. We've been sort of reflexively trained to think that the correct context for interpreting the Bible is ours, or the history of Christianity, the Reformation, the Catholic Church, evangelicalism. Guys, none of those contexts are the correct context for interpreting the Bible. They are all foreign contexts when it comes to the original writers and the original recipients. And so, in the sessions we have tonight, I'm just really picking and choosing certain things to give a broad overview, sort of a bird's eye view of the content of written in the book that's out of the sun, The Unseen Realm, subtitled Recovering the Supernatural World through the Bible. The wording is deliberate, because we just don't think this way anymore. So if you're interested in biblical studies, at all, and especially if you assign sacred status to the Bible, there are some things, again, that you just need to have in your head to really understand it. And it matters for all sorts of things in the Bible and biblical theology. So let's jump in here. The first thing we want to talk about is sort of fundamental to an Israelite's worldview. So we're going to start with the Old Testament. Ancient Israel, something called the Divine Council, that is going to be foreign to many of you, but which would have been elementary, again, to an ancient Israelite. And so the textbook passage is Psalm 82. Now I have here Psalm 82. This is the ESV, English Standard Version, very common version. And And what I want you to notice here, in the first verse, God has taken his place in the divine council, and this is the gods who holds judgment. The word God here is highlighted in blue, and the column here is highlighted in blue. And this is just a graphic illustration from something called a adversary when you Bible, which the company I went for produces, to show you that the word God here is the word Elohim. Very common word for God. Many of you have probably heard that. Okay, nothing really surprises. However, if you keep going in the verse, we have in the midst of the gods he holds judgment. Gods here now highlighted in blue. That is also Elohim. So you have the same word, Elohim, occur 2 times in the same verse. The first time, it's translated singularly, and there are good reasons for that. Grammar. In Hebrew, it's Elohim Nitzav Ba'adar El. Nitzav is the verb form, the participle, it's singular. It tells you, hey, the subject that goes with this is Elohim, translated as singular. The grammatic would be. The second one, in the midst of the gods, and in Greek speak, compound preposition in the midst of. And you have Elohim, simply in the midst of one entity. Midst, as far as good, those means you need to translate the plural. I think yes really reflects that. So, take a look at the verse. I narrate my own little story in the book. I have taught biblical studies on the college level for 5 years. I've been to 2 different seminaries. I was in a doctoral program in Hebrew Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I had never looked at Psalm 82 more. And the first time I did, it was sort of mind altering, because it sounds like a pantheon. And Old Testament theology, Israelite theology, is like it's not supposed to have a pantheon. But right there it is in Psalm 82, verse 1, black and white, so to speak, in Hebrew. Elohim 2 times, 1 singular, 1 plural. Now, if you go down to verse 6, the speaker in the psalm is, at this point in the psalm, God. Verses 2 to 5, God is raking the gods of the council over the coals, his mad about because they're not just. They oppress the poor, they're corrupt, and he starts going after them. And he says in verse 6, I said, your gods, here we have Elohim again, sons of the Most High, all of you. There has to be plural. Sons, okay? And we have you, plural pronoun, and yet it has to be plural. There's no way to get around sounds. What many who do encounter this, if you have a study Bible, if you're looking at that, you might get a footnote, something to the effect that, oh, well, the gods here in Psalm 82, don't worry, there's nothing to observe here. It just, we probably do it, because the gods here are just, Israelite elders, something like that, the judges of Israel from Exodus 18, when Moses appointed elders at the suggestion of Jethro, his father-in-law, and signed. Well, that doesn't work real well. If you go over to Psalm 89, it doesn't work real well for lots of reasons, but here's one. You've got verse 5, you let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. We have that idea, assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord, who among the heavenly beings? And the Hebrew is the name Baalim. Baalim is other plural out in this case. Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? The last time I checked, there is no council of Israelite judges that lives in the skies and that runs the affairs of the world from the skies. It just doesn't work. But I'm telling you, if you go to standard commentaries, study Bibles, things like that, that is what you're going to read. Nothing to see here. Don't be troubled. It's just people. That people don't live in the skies. This isn't like Lando Calendars, sky sitting, all that stuff. There's no help that. It'd be designed. So what do we do? I mean, what do we do with this sort of thing? Well, we're going to talk about that, because this is part of the Israelite worldview. Jesus certainly knew Psalm 82. He quotes it in John chapter 10. And it is the people that are here. It's quoting verse 6, which we just saw. The apostles certainly knew Psalm 82. Lots of the Jewish rabbis in the centuries knew Psalm 82. The Israelites knew Psalm 82. And yet, again, they're monotheistic. Well, how in the world does this work? So we have a number of references to sons of God. And I've just listed a few. We will get Deuteronomy 32:8. There's a reason for the asterisk there. We'll hit that in a moment. But this is not an uncommon term. Everywhere else, the name you lean of the real Curtis, you're going to have plural divine being situations, whether it's heavenly or this heavenly council. Again, we may hit Genesis 6 for the Q&A. There's also a lot of verses where God is among or above who tell us where to do your read. So, if the Israelite writers, the biblical writer, didn't believe that the gods were real, and that is the proposition here tonight as we start off, that the biblical writers believed the gods were real, why would they be writing that, hey, our God is above all those other gods? Our God is among them, but better than them. I mean, if they're just cartoon beings, it sort of strips the magnitude, it strips the glory out. It would be like me saying, hey, my God's better than Spider-Man. Wow, that's fast. Spider-Man's a fictional character. I bet it's him too, because I at least exist. I mean, you can't begin to reduce the content of what you actually see in the biblical text to some sort of cartoonish status. That is not the way Israel had looked at it. Deuteronomy 32:17 right here is kind of interesting, because it refers to the Elohim with another term. We'll hit this again a little bit later too. It refers to the Elohim as the Shadim. Most of your English translations will translate that as demons. It's kind of it's a wonderful translation. It's kind of clunky. But the fact is that the Elohim in Deuteronomy 32:17 were considered real and real threats. We don't worship them. Paul, the Apostle Paul, quotes Deuteronomy 32:17, 1 Corinthians 10, also using the term demons. So if you're thinking, I want to understand why the way the biblical writers understood it, but I'm not going to accept the fact that they would believe the gods were real. Well, then you have to go to 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul quotes this passage and deny that Paul believed in demons too. It's just a strategy that doesn't work. But I understand, again, why we have this sort of sensibility, because when we see the word God today, in modern context, whether it's Christian context or Jewish context, Islamic context, any theistic religion, and even outside, build that little box there. When we see God, we sort of mentally assume and assign a specific set of attributes to God. Things like omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and a familiar sort of grocery list that we were a Bible doctrine, a church, a catechism, or something like that. When we see those concepts, G-O-D, see that word, see those letters, our mind just assigns attributes to them. And then we think of verses that have these phrases, where God says, there is none besides, there is none like, besides me there is no other. And just based upon what I've already shown you should raise, again, a question. Well, how can they say this? And yet go back to Psalm 82 and Psalm 89. They had the other passage that I just had a list for here that talk about God is among the gods and greater than gods, and sons of God are the gods. How can you do this? How can you say all this stuff in the same sacred text? How does it work? Well, for modern Christians and really modern Jews, let's think of my advisor one here, so it was fellowship that purpose what I would call a serious Jew, maybe not very conservative, but a serious one. Our solution to this is just deny that the other gods exist. That's silly. And then we impose our conception on that of the ancient person. Then, but if you start denying those things, you have to deny other things attached to them. Remember Paul's quotation. You just have to interpret the text as a modern offensive, not as an ancient person. And you can do whatever you want, but you can't call it biblical theology when you do it, is the point. Read it when you have your theology derived from the text. This is a Seder text, it's a court for your eye. Well, these phrases again occur a number of places, and I would suggest to you, they are not denials of the existence of other gods, because then you have pretty hopeless contradiction. What they are is statements of the incomparability of one God to the other ones. Statements of incomparability versus statements of non-existence. Now, this is actually pretty easy to demonstrate. This was part of my dissertation. I'm certainly not avoiding that. But fundamentally, you have a problem because the denial, these so-called denial statements, there's nothing besides, they show up in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32 we've already talked about a little bit. But elsewhere affirm the existence of other gods in the same chapter. So again, how do we deal with this? I think these are the two verses that are key. The same denial phrases show up in both of these passages, Isaiah 47:10 and Zephaniah 2. In one passage, the city of Babylon says, there is none besides me. And in the other passage, it's the city of Nineveh saying there's none like me, there is none besides me. Now, are we really going to believe that the biblical writer was so dumb to put such a statement in the mouth of Babylon? I'm the only city that there is in the world. All other cities don't exist. There's none besides. Is that really what the writer meant? Of course not. It's absurd. What the writer meant to put in the mouth of Babylon, Babylon's often the Old Testament. And Nineveh was just awful because it was associated with the Syrians, who were the Klingons of the Old Testament, who were thinking of ours. Just inept Jews. And Nineveh and Babylon are typical enemies in the Old Testament story. And what they need to say here is that we're the best. Babylon says there's none besides, there is no city on the planet like us, like Babylon. And Nineveh makes the same claim. They've got statements that other cities don't exist. They're statements of incomparability. It's actually not very complicated. But again, we think it's complicated because when we sing G-O-D, we assign a unique set of attributes to the word, and then we go to, again, these denial states and say, well, this isn't possible. The other gods can't exist in the mind of the biblical writers. Or we just say, yeah, this is freaking me out because we're believing monotheists. How can we do this? How can we be monotheists when we go to the biblical text to see this stuff? There's actually a very simple way to do this. What we have is a cultural context problem. A modern context, that would be us, versus the biblical writers, and again, the original recipients, their context. It's just different worldviews, different ways of thinking about the same thing. The answers are actually right in front of us in the biblical text. If you ask yourself the question, who or what is or are Elohim? What you would find, if you again do a search, and I've had bored with tricks of Bible software for instance for you, but I just give you the results here. Elohim, again, that word that shows up twice in Psalm 82, once singular, once plural, in meaning, is actually used of half a dozen different entities in the Hebrew Bible. God of Israel is an obvious one. The gods of the council, the gods of the nations, for instance, Ashtoreth, who is a goddess. Biblical Hebrew actually doesn't have a word for goddess, probably. It doesn't come before. It just refers to the goddess as Elohim, which is a masculine term. Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the Elohim of the Ammonites. So you have the gods of the nations. You have demons, quote unquote, the Shenim in Deuteronomy 32:17. The disembodied human dead are referred to as Elohim in 1 Samuel 28:13. For those of you to recall this incident, this passage, 1 Samuel 28 is the story of the witch with a medium at Thendor, where Saul, king of Israel, has run all the meetings of people who practice necromancy and all this other stuff. He's running out of the country. But somehow he knows where to find one when he needs one. And he goes to a medium who lives at Endor and goes to her in disguise, doesn't tell her who he is, and says, I need you to contact Samuel for me. Samuel is a prophet, who's the person who anointed Saul. Samuel had died, and Saul is in big trouble with the Philistines. It looks like the end for him, and he needs to consult Samuel because the biblical text says God was not hearing his prayers. So he goes to the meeting at Endor and says, I need to talk to Samuel to get the job. And she agrees, and while she's doing her thing, she says, well, I see an Elohim coming up out of the ground. And Saul's first question, and really before he gets to articulate, once she sees him, she turns to Saul and gets freaked out. You're Saul. She does the math in her head there. And he's like, don't worry about that. I can tell you, I assure you, what does he look like? And she describes it. And Saul's like, yep, that's him. And they have a conversation where the disembodied Samuel essentially repeats information that God had given him earlier in his life about Saul and his fate. It basically says, why did you bother me? You're toast. Now leave me alone. That's my translation. But we have, again, the disembodied human dead referred to as Elohim. And we have at least one angel referred to as Elohim. And you have to put a few passages together. We'll talk about Genesis 48, which is a really important one, a little later tonight. But here's the question. Would the biblical writer see all of these things on the same level? In other words, would the biblical writer assume that, hey, my dead Aunt Rivka is on an ontological par with the God of Israel. They're basically the same miracles. Really. You're dead in hands to the God of Israel. They're the same. It's ridiculous. But yet, if Elohim is used to denote a specific set of attributes, the way we think of GRD, that's what you have to say. You're saying that when you see the term Elohim, there are certain attributes that go with it. And if you have more than one of them, then you have polytheism. That is not the way a biblical writer would process the terminology. A biblical writer is no fool. I mean, he doesn't believe, again, that the Shekim are as powerful as the God of Israel. He doesn't believe that the human dead are as powerful as the God of Israel. But yet he uses the same terminology for all of them. That alone should tell you that Elohim does not mean a specific set of attributes. It is not to be aligned with a specific set of attributes. That is not the way the biblical writer is. In other words, the biblical writer is not using Elohim the way we use God. So, what he was talking about? What Elohim really means, really denotes, is probably better to say it. For the biblical writer, and again, the original Israelite context, you would use Elohim to describe a being or an entity that by nature was disembodied and an inhabitant of the spiritual world. That's what Elohim means. If you are by nature, not embodied, your body less, your spirit being, and you are occupant of the spirit world, you are, by definition, an Elohim. Now, in that realm, in that neighborhood, again, here we have the neighborhood. God's the council, the demons, disembodied dead, angels, and of course, Yahweh, God of Israel. Then we're going to talk about God and thinking in the Old Testament, the greatest degree. All of those are inhabitants of the spiritual world. Now, in that world, in that neighborhood, there is rank. There is hierarchy. There is differentiation of attributes. Here's what an Orthodox Israelite would believe. If you walked up, let's just use Abraham, because of a perfect example. If you walked up to Abraham and said, "Hey, believer, is there more than one Elohim?" Abraham would look at you and say, "Well, duh. Of course." If your next question was, and those guys are all the same, right? He probably would punch you in the face. No. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is an Elohim. But no other Elohim is Yahweh. That is what an Orthodox Israelite, a biblical writer, would have believed. Because they're not using Elohim to denote the specifically unique attributes of Yahweh. Now they do that in other ways. Yahweh, the Elohim that is Yahweh, is described as the creator. None of the other Elohim are. Psalm 29 has been a command to them to worship Yahweh. He's the one who deserves worship. His followers are to worship no other. He is the rightful recipient of human worship. They describe Yahweh as sovereign over the affairs. So it had to be. No other Elohim can describe that way. There are passages that credit Yahweh with creating all the other things. It's never the other way around. And so the biblical writer had ways to distinguish Yahweh as human. But one of those ways was not using the term Elohim. So if you go back to Psalm 82, we do not have polytheism like we figure. We impose that on the passage because we see the plural term. But it has nothing to do with attributes. Psalm 82 is about God presiding over a council, an assembly, a group, a house, whatever you want to call it, of spirit beings. Now, in that case, who happen to be in charge of the nations. We'll talk about that in this one. So in terms of council language, if you were to take biblical language about the divine council and its members, and you would compare them and say, this is a very common conception in the ancient world. All ancient religions had pantheons. The issue is, how did they parse the relationships? And how did they parse the attributes? For an Orthodox Israelite, you would have Yahweh at the top, never the potential to remove him. He is omnipotent, he's sovereign, he's creative, he's this, he's that. He's all this, the stuff that we traditionally think about God in the Judeo-Christian worldview. He is at the top. The sons of God are in the middle tier. It's a three-tiered system in Israelite thinking and in Canaanite thinking in other ancient religions. This term is not an ontological one, it's a functional one. Sons of God is like the divine household, an inner circle. The ones that not necessarily having different powers or different attributes, but who have different roles, very important tasks. And then at the bottom are the malachim, which is the Hebrew word for messenger or angel. Greek term is angelos, that's where we get angel, just means messenger. This is the lowest rank because their job is to take and bring messages. That's what they do. They're not assigned in the biblical, again, the biblical writers view of the supernatural world, call all words. They're never assigned high-level tasks. It's a low-level task. Now, there's one exception to this. The Malach means the Lord. And the reason he's different is because he is identified with and as Yahweh. There's passages. So that's in the special case. So that's that clear as eye. You also have throne guardians, sort of staff people. Entities. Cherubim is a throne guard. It comes from an Akkadian term, kaluv. Seraphim is the same thing. It just comes from an Egyptian term, seraph. Your serpent will guard the coast. So they're throne guardians from each different culture. It's curious to talk about why one text uses the term from Mesopotamia, the other uses Egyptian term, we talked about that. But this is, again, how things are distinguished. And the reason this is not polytheism in the background again is because the plural language has nothing to do with attributes or college. In terms of being me, said it's about what neighborhood to belong. It's also not henotheism, because in a henotheistic system, it's closer to henotheism than polytheism. It's not henotheistic because in a henotheistic system, the top deity can be displaced and replaced. There's the potential for another god to elevate to the highest position, to sort of win that position. And you're not going to find anything in the Hebrew Bible that talks that way about the spiritual world. Here's what I think. Now, does God need a counsel? I get this question a lot when I do this presentation. Like this is crazy talk. God is in your house, and maybe God somewhere is dependent. He needs help. I just talked to the Christians here in the audience for a moment. He doesn't need you either. There's this thing called the Great Commission. God decided, hey, I want humans to participate in this thing that I could do in an instant. But I'm not going to do it in an instant. I'm going to have people, my angels, my children, participate with to recover and reclaim the nations. Because that's a phrase of the practice. And you're right, God is in the council. He does choose to use one. This is the language we see before. He doesn't need anyone, but he chooses to use agents, whether they're spiritual beings or angels, or they're human beings, like you. He doesn't need the help. But this is the way he does it. This is what Scripture describes. Now, there are certain council members in rebellion. We find out from different passages. Deuteronomy 32 is one. You come back to that passage, Psalm 2 of the 4 passages. They are excluded from the council because they are disloyal. It's their level thinking. They do their thing in an adversarial way to the God of Israel, his children, on earth, and again, in the spirit world. There's conflict, there's turmoil, there's warfare. It could go like the sort of a buzzword in Christian circles, spiritual warfare. And that is a picture you get not just from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament as well. There is conflict and turmoil and the battles, as you will. Not everyone is on the same team. And again, participatory governance is a big deal. Let's talk about the gods of the nations. I mentioned this briefly a couple of times, and I think this is something that will be new to just about everyone here, unless you sort of read ahead. Deuteronomy 32:8-9. If you have the ESV or the new RSV, you will get these two verses correct. The ESV, again, I think is the better one because it includes the material of the divine text. It goes through the issue. You have another verse, go ahead and open it. Deuteronomy 32:8-9. Because what can we do? Now it's the reading like your eyes. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, when did that happen in the biblical story? The Tower of Babel. So everybody gets scattered, the nations are divided, all that stuff. When the Most High did that, we know that the Most High is the biblical thinking. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. And then later in the same chapter, we have rejoice with him among the all gods. then you won't read this either. If you have something different than ESV, probably or RSV at that point. The reason is the ESV incorporates the Dead Sea Scroll reading for this verse in its written translation. The other ones do not. The other verses are going to read, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, and divided mankind, he fixed the borders, the people squared the number of the sons of Israel. And then this verse is not going to have any reference to gods at all. It's a different Hebrew text, one that cannot be traced back to Qumran, to Dead Sea Scrolls. The scholars have known about this for a real time. Even before the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, brings angels here. That their Bible reference to angels as well. So if you're going with the oldest Hebrew text available to us today, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is what you're reading. But you don't need to be a textual critic to know that this is the correct read. Let's just put our thinking caps over here. If the nations were divided at Babel, Tower of Babel is that, why doesn't it make sense to say that God divided them up according to the number of the sons of Israel?
Is the order staggers?
A little louder. So why that's what else?
Israel had these portions as right to himself.
Israel wasn't established. There was no Israel. Abraham is only called after the Babylonians. Israel does not exist at the Tower of Babel. So it makes no sense to say, you know, never recorded the sons of Israel. Israel's not even around. It doesn't even exist. If you look at the table of nations, Genesis 10, the Bible story is Genesis 11. If you look at the table of nations, Genesis 10, where the Old Testament, all the nations in the world that descended from Noah's sons in the biblical story are listed, guess who's not there? Israel. Israel doesn't exist. So a reading that says sons of Israel makes zero sense. And textually, it's not the demonstrably best text. Okay? This is why, yes, we decided, you know what, instead of putting it in a footnote, a lot of translations allow the footnote to use. Fine. We're going to put it right in the running text because it's just obvious that this is what the original text would have read. So they did it. That was an editorial decision. Here is the Qumran scroll. We have transliteration by the Hebrew alphabet, the name theme. Right here, your Qumran handling is for copy. That's what. Not nice and neat like our blog script. That's narrated nearly to the ALS at the end here. This is a matter of finding the chop off a little bit because the text is fragmentary, but it's there. True. This is 4 QQ and 10 the text beats there. Now, what does it all mean though? What does Deuteronomy 32:8-9 mean? When Most High divides the nations, divide them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. What it means is that the table of nations, these are all the nations listed in Genesis 10. Put yourself in the biblical story. The wrath of the flood, the descendants of Noah, God reiterates the command to be fruitful and multiply after the flood to Noah and his family. So what God wants them to do is to spread through the earth and do what they were supposed to do, what Adam and Eve were supposed to do, what were they supposed to do? They were to make the rest of the planet like we subdue the earth, go out there, this is where the presence of God is, this is supposed to paradise, we're going to death. Now we want you to go out and spread what you see here out there so that the kingdom of God had spread throughout the earth. Twisted God, it works, it can't. What were they doing instead? No. You like Babel. So some of them, go out, but they're a bunch of congregates in Babylon. And eventually, that's where the story takes us. They're building a ziggurat in Babylon, the tower. Anybody know what a ziggurat is? It's stair-step kind of pyramid things. Now the nice pyramids, even sides you see in Egypt. They're like step pyramids. There's a couple million too. But what is its for? Well, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, Babylon, were part of temple complexes. They were specifically designed to create a place for the deity to come and eat with the people. In other words, they localized the deity. It's the exact opposite of what God told them to do. Instead of spread the earth and make worshippers of me everywhere and all that sort of stuff, it's like, no, we're going to build you a little shrine there, so it's a pretty big one. And you're going to come to us. We're going to localize you. And in response, God says, forget that. Just forget. You don't want to listen to me again. We are on the other side of the book. We still have this problem. Fine. I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to disinherit you. I'm no longer going to have a personal relationship with you. Instead, I'm going to disinherit you and assign you to lesser gods, to the sons of God. I'm going to divvy you up and assign your domain to one of them, and vice versa. The parallel passage to Deuteronomy 32:8-9 is Deuteronomy 4:18-20, where the Israelites are told, don't worship the host of heaven. Those beings, those guys who have been allotted to the nations and the nations to rent. So this is a punishment. Deuteronomy 32:8-9 describes a punishment. God severing the relationship. I'm just going to put you under the authority of the sons of God so that it work for me. And if that's what you want, you don't want to be as your God, I'm going to give you what you asked for. We'll see how that works. Now we know God turns in the biblical story right after battle, calls Abraham, and says essentially, I'm going to start over. Okay, I've divorced now. I'm going to start over. I'm going to have my own people. That's why verse 9 says Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. I'm going to start over. But when he makes the covenant with Abraham, notice what he does. He says to Abraham, I'm going to make you stars in the sky, all this great stuff, their offspring. And then he says in verse 3, Genesis 12:3, right after Genesis 11, the Bible story, he says, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So he hasn't forgotten the nations completely. But he's also not in direct relationship with them. We know from Acts 17, Paul refers to this event in his Sermon on Mount Hill. And he says, again, something to the effect that, God, set these boundaries so that one day, people in the nations could find their way back to the true God. Now, Paul viewed himself as part of that mission. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. But that was part of the purpose. And really, he told exactly how it worked. Israel is called by the king of the priests. What priests do, they mediate the relationship between the divine and the human. Israel is described in certain ways that the nations were supposed to be attracted back to the true God because of that, because of their just laws, because of the winning lives, because of the victories they got against. All these things that you read about. This was the idea, but in Psalm 82, God is angry because the sons of the Most High have become corrupt. They have manipulated and undermined and abused the people of the nations under their charge. It's going to have a significant payoff. Let's just skip ahead here. For sure. Here's the whole psalm. How long will you, God's judge and unjust, show partiality to the wicked, and all this bad stuff? Basically, you're causing lots of upheaval. And the Bible has this as you have the soul and earth thing going on. So it affects the symbiotic relationship between the spirit world and the physical world. Foundations of the earth are shaken. Your gods, some of the Most High, all of you, nevertheless, you're going to die like that. God says, I'm going to punish you for this. You are going to die like that. That alone suggests they aren't meant to begin with. You're going to die like men. Fall like any prince. And then the psalmist says, arise, O God, judge the earth. For, look at the phrase, you shall inherit all things. You're going to get it back. Please take them back. This is the revision of the Old Testament. Go back here. This whole idea is the backdrop for what we would call, and what scholars would call cosmic geography in the Old Testament. This is part of the Old Testament world, supernatural world. Yes, there's God, the God of Israel, but there are lots of gods. Some of them are loyal to him, some of them are his enemies. He assigned the nations to those other gods, and the gods to those nations as a punishment at battle. They became corrupt. They seduced the Israelites. If you read through the book of Deuteronomy, where all this stuff is, that we've been talking about tonight, the Israelites get seduced by these other gods to worship them instead of Yahweh. The whole story of the Old Testament goes back to this thinking. It's Yahweh against the gods and Israel against the nations. This is why. This is the Old Testament rationale for why the nations have pantheons, why they have other gods, why we have this antipathy between them and us. It's because of this judgment and the corruption of beings that were initially loyal to Yahweh, members of his council, who became corrupt. And the Old Testament story is we're living with the results. There's lots of other things that go into the Old Testament worldview. I'm just glad to hear that. There are some interesting passages. I'll just give you three examples here of how this plays out. My personal favorite is 2 Kings 5. This is the story of Naaman, the leper, with skin disease. So again, if you know the story, let's do a quick time check here. If you know the story, Naaman has this horrible skin disease, and he can't do anything about it. So this little slave girl that apparently got captured at some point, taken to Syria, where Naaman's at, he's a Syrian, says to him, why don't you just go to Israel and have Elisha the prophet cure you? You don't need me. He doesn't say that, but it's essentially what you get out of it. And he's like, okay, I'll try it. So he gets a bunch of his men, goes down, and the prophet won't even meet. He doesn't even come out to meet them. This is an important guy. He's captain of the guard in Syria. He's the king's personal assistant. And Elisha says, just tell him to go dip himself 7 times in Jordan. I think like yes. And then he throws a fit. He wrote the story of his real man. He's believed, and his entourage says, if he'd have said do something spectacular, you would have done it. Why don't you just do this simple thing and just give it a try? So he does. And again, you know the story, he's healed. He goes back to Elisha, and what does he ask for? He says, I know now that Yahweh is the God of prophets. If it's okay with you, I'd like to do what? Give me a rubber? Get some dirt. Yeah. Would it be okay if I load my mules with dirt so I can take it back with me? What? Dirt? You want dirt? Why dirt? And the narrative explains a little bit. He says, well, part of my job is I have to go into the temple of Ramon, the Syrian god, with the king. The king's kind of, he's going to bow before him, and he's going to lean on me. I'll kind of bow to you. We have the king on the side here. It's just kind of awkward. It doesn't really tell us what he wants to do with the dirt. But the concept is clear. Israel's dirt is holy ground. It is dirt, it is ground associated with the God of Israel, the God of gods. So he wants to know if it's okay to take the dirt back with him. And we're not told, did he wear it all around his neck in a pouch? Did he put some in his pocket bits? We don't know what he did with it. Did he sprinkle a little bit when he had to go to the temple of Ramon? I don't know. But he wants it with him. He wants the dirt. It only makes sense in a worldview that treated the gods seriously. Cosmic geography. When Dagon, when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and they take it into the temple of Dagon. And that's a familiar Sunday school story. It's kind of comical. Put it in there with Dagon. The next day, Dagon's out the stump, his arms, his legs, his head are cut off. He's just topped it there on the floor. And the Philistines get freaked out and say, we need to get rid of this thing. We know the story, but we don't know a little throwaway part of it. In that story, it says this. After they find Dagon in a stump, it says that unto this day, the priests of Dagon do not walk across the threshold. Why? Because that little piece of turf inside Dagon's temple is under dominion of another god, namely the God of Israel, because he made mincemeat out of Dagon. So even though they're doing their thing in Dagon's temple, when they get to the spot, when they found Dagon, they walk around. It's cosmic geography. 1 Samuel 26, David is upset because he's been driven out of Judah. And he says, what am I going to do now? How can I pray to the God of Israel? David is not denying omnipresence. He associates the worship of Yahweh of Israel with Judah, with holy ground. He's in Philistine territory. He doesn't quite know what to do. It bothers him. Again, this is just the way the Old Testament Israelites would have thought about their God, their gods, gods of the nations. Things took it serious. They were real entities. Daniel chapter 10 is probably a little bit familiar. There are supernatural princes assigned to nations. Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, Michael is the Prince of Israel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. It's the same idea. There is a direct relationship between certain divine beings and certain geographical locations, regions, nations, whatever. And this is the Old Testament worldview. We can talk a little bit about the Edenic vision here, what the point is. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. But why all the, why the nation is important when it comes down to. And it comes down to the fact that in the beginning, and this is Genesis 1, God created humanity in the biblical story. He creates Eden. Eden is where he lives. It's his abode. It's his residence. It's his home office because what he is, his counsel is as well. It's where he does business. Heaven comes to earth. And God decides to make humanity a part of that. He wants to be Lord of all.
Humanity comes to push to all.
And that's the original vision. We get plural language here. Let us bring man into our image, get our likeness. And let them rule over the vision, sea, and soul. And then it switches to singular here. So God created man in his image. The image of God created he created him. We've got plural and singular. Why the plurals? What is the image? What's the point? I'm not going to go into a long lecture about the image. We spent 2 chapters in the book line. The image of God is not a thing put in you. It is not an attribute. I used to teach ethics class at a Christian college, and I always look forward to the day when we talk about abortion, because I knew what I was going to do. I would walk into how many of you are pro-life? Most brand or you're off Christian college, and say why? Well, human life is sacred. Why? Or the image of God, really. What is the image of God? You get all sorts of answers. The ability to pray, intelligence, ability to commune with God, having a spirit, having an nefesh, the soul, all these things. When you point out to them that spirit and nefesh, spirit and soul in the Old Testament, are also assigned in animals, and you ask them questions like, well, does the little cellular thing in the contents of the woman's womb to that pray? Does it have intelligence? Does it have any attribute associated with a functioning brain? God. So it's why? Let's make white and collide. So what I wanted them to see was that it is flawed thinking in terms of biblical theology to define the image as any attribute and quality that human being has. Because humans don't possess all these qualities equally all the time. And you can lose intelligence, Alzheimer's, You can't link this idea to attributes. And the biblical person didn't either. There's a point of human grammar that actually parses this really well. The image of God is not a thing given to us. The key is what is in his identity. How do we use the word in? If I say, put the dishes in the sink, what do I mean? Talking about location. If I say, I broke the vase in pieces, what do I mean? I'm using in there to denote results of an action. If I say that the paper was written in pencil, I'm using in to denote an instrument. See, we use the word in lots of semantic ways. If I say, I work in medicine, what do I mean? I mean, I work as a doctor or a PA or a nurse or something. It describes my function or my role. That, in Hebrew grammar, is called the vet accenture, with vet predication. That is what the image of God is. It is a role. It is a status. It is a function. It is not an attribute. If you are human, you are God's image. That's what it means. Just to being human is to being image. Because in biblical thinking, other nations would make idols, objects that represented their gods. Israelite theology didn't allow for that. Orthodox Israelite theology. Instead, God made humans to be his likeness. It's a status. It is what you are. The plurals tell us that God made other beings to represent him too. In the spirit world, heavenly hosts, this is who God is speaking to. This is not a trinity. There's no way to exegetically restrict this to 3. God is speaking to his heavenly host. They are his images as well. He's saying, we're going to create beings down here, and they're going to represent me too. They're going to share some relationship with you guys. Namely, they're going to image me like you image me. And you're also going to have attributes. We may not have the attributes all equal. We all have different sensitive abilities. But we all have the same status. We're his images. The same with now. It's the equivalent of me saying, hey, let's go get pizza. Let us get pizza. And then we all get in my car. And I pay.
We participate.
This is why it goes from plural to singular, because when the actual creation happens, there is only one creator. And there is only one task to represent him. I mean, whatever know they hear it, humans it's earth, spiritual beings it's the spirit world. If this is part of biblical thinking, they took the supernatural context of who they were, who humanity was, and the task to make the whole world like this place. We can all be one big family.
Divine beings with us, who are in line with God. God's presence is here.
God has also spoken of anthropomorphically in Genesis 3. He's walking around. One big happy family, one place. Heaven meets earth is of this one.
That's the biblical thing.
But, it doesn't work that way. By the time you get into chapter 11, in the biblical story in Genesis, it's all ruined. Now we've got godliness to gods, miserable destinations. And that's the way it is for the rest of the Old Testament. And frankly, a lot of the New Testament as well. Now, the key point here is, do we think like this? Even in the book, I basically argued in the early parts of the book that to really understand how the biblical writers were thinking, and this is again just one point, even though it's a fundamental point, but they were predisposed to thinking in supernatural terms. The supernatural world was real. It not only intersected with their world, but our world has its destiny tied to that world, and vice versa. It never went away. They were that was where they were at.
I was left here, the believer's family.
In my experience, most people who get more take by this seriously
Don't think that way to them.
God, Jesus,
Angels, demons, Satan, Babel, and a little fight duck.
the spiritual world of the Old Testament,
The New Testament is a whole lot wider than that. And there's a whole lot more going on. Only in a couple of examples.
but they were predisposed to thinking this way. And if they were, the stuff that they wrote is written from that perspective. So you have to have that in your head to understand lots of things that are going on in Scripture. All these weird passages. What does it say in 1 Corinthians 6? Paul says, stop suing each other, stop going to secular court. Don't you know that you're going to judge angels? Goes back to this. Give that head covered. Goes back to this. All sorts of throwaway statements where Jesus goes, what he says when it gets there, is tied to Old Testament cosmic geography. In many places, those places have a history. And often isn't a good one. And the gospel writers are picking and choosing what they want to tell us about the life of Jesus, or it simply says. And in many cases, they're very ignorant about what they were reading. For a person in the first century would have caught a lot of these things immediately. We don't, because we're just from a very high place. So, what I'm going to try to do, look at a little break. We'll hit specifically Godhead thinking in the Old Testament, and then talk about how this filters into the New Testament as well. So, is Will here? I don't see Will. Oh, listen, Mr. It was walking. You want to break the 5 money with? Sure. Yep. Water break? Sure. Water break? Yep. Water break.